Hello.
How
Hi, Yasmin.
how are you guys? Hey, big shout out. What an amazing day today. It's first of all, for me personally, it's so gratifying to be a part of what is an amazing panel of people, professionals, companies. It's really thrilling to be a part of this, and I couldn't be happier to be here with someone who is a dynamic professional in Yasmin Grant, and doing amazing work. Both in her community and at PepsiCo. So thank you for hosting us today. Today I'm hoping that through this conversation, this kind of virtual fireside chat, we can accomplish a couple of things. I'm hopeful that we can, first and foremost, get to know Yasmin, the person. I'm a big believer that personal journeys inform the professional, and you can't separate the two. And in the world we're living in today, where diversity and inclusion are more important, if anything, the most paramount things happening in our lives, it's important for us to know people personally, and how that experience and that life journey is impacting how they act professionally, what they bring to the table every day as a human being. And we've got a phenomenal person in Yasmin to talk about her story, and give us the opportunity to kind of leap off into kind of really interesting territory here related to the work that she's doing. Also, I'd love to point out the fact that, what makes it really exciting for me is, I've spent my whole career, as you heard in the intro, working at like some really great companies. Our friends at CBS, Viacom, know many of them, have worked there. Big kind of legacy media companies. And in the past few years, I've been running sales and brand partnerships at Tastemade, who's a global media company, kind of a company of the whole world. Producing content in 7 languages with studios around the world. And just last week, we launched our Tastemade en Espanol streaming network. And the reason I pointed it out is because it was time to, a National Hispanic Heritage Month. And that's why I was so excited to speak to Yasmin today, because, we as a company are really vested in global conversations, in diverse communities, and to have somebody on the panel today like Yasmin is super exciting. So let's get started. Hi, Yasmin.
Hi, Jeff. Good to see you again.
Oh, it's so great to see you. So let's get started with, let's talk about PepsiCo, but more importantly, right now, let's talk about you. We know that Pepsi is one of the largest food, snack, and beverage companies around the world, made up of phenomenal brands, right? That we've all kind of grew up with or have experienced in various stages of our lives. But I think sometimes we lose sight of the amazing people that power the organizations that feed us every day, right? So let's talk about how your personal journey has fueled that professional journey for you. Start where you want to. I know your CV. I know what you've done. Let's tell everybody in the community, how it started for you.
Absolutely. And first, Jeff, let me say I appreciate that lovely intro that you gave me. And I completely agree with you, right? So much of my personal story and my background has shaped my career and made me the person that I am. So I'm originally from Baltimore, Maryland. I grew up in a single parent household. For undergrad, I went to Hampton University, which is a historically Black college and university. And then, I embarked on my career in healthcare. So I worked for Eli Lilly and Company, which is a huge pharmaceutical company that, makes a variety of drugs in different therapeutic areas. And, I started off in finance, and in finance, I supported R&D, and I, had access to a lot of the drugs that were in the development pipeline. And candidly, that really piqued my interest. I just, became really, really curious about what we were going to do with those drugs when it was time to, bring them to market. And, also too, at the same time, I just wanted to get closer to something that was more tangible. And so that led me to join the sales force with Lilly. And, I focused on diabetes sales, and I transitioned to that role in DC. And I had Northeast, Southeast DC, and I had parts of Prince George's County, Maryland. And so for people not familiar with DC, those are very high African American, high Hispanic communities. And I think in that role, what I really got a lot of exposure to is the health challenges that our underrepresented communities face, challenges with access and healthcare coverage, language barriers, right? Obviously, for the Hispanic population, there are a lot of folks that, need materials in language other than, English. And I just always found myself working to tailor the resources, calling up the marketing department and saying, hey, how can we customize some of these solutions to better meet the needs? And, for me, that really fostered a sense of wanting to have more strategic input in things. I had, a strong desire to want to shape things, not just execute things. And I felt like transitioning to marketing and going to business school is the best way to do that. So I found out about MLT, or Management Leadership for Tomorrow, which is an organization that helps underrepresented minorities get into business school. And with their support, I ended up going to Kellogg and, just learning so much, about the fundamentals of marketing. So then fast forward, and after business school, I came out at a time when the economy was, kind of precarious, I guess not unlike what it is right now, but for different reasons. And, that led me to a startup. And, the startup, you wear a lot of hats. You learn so much in such a short time frame. But, the startup was in the the household care space. And I just wasn't passionate about household care. I wasn't passionate about laundry in particular. And so, I always wanted to do marketing in a category where consumers had more of an emotional connection to the brands, right? Where it's connected to those moments that matter. And that led me to PepsiCo. And I've had a variety of different roles at PepsiCo. And for the past year, I've been director of marketing for the Hispanic business unit, which is a team that was formed solely to aggressively go after the Hispanic opportunity in the marketing space. And, I head up the flavors business there. And then I'm also involved in, a lot of things outside of my day job. So I'm co-chair of Mosaic, which is our Black employee resource group. I'm also on the advisory board for the League, which is an initiative that was started in marketing to uplift female marketers. And then obviously with the racial climate being what it is, we have formed a task force to really identify the right equality actions to undertake on behalf of the Black community. And I'm a part of that. So I think, I've been with PepsiCo for 7 years. What has kept me here is the fact that, I can do meaningful work, right? I feel like I'm doing work that makes a difference. And PepsiCo gives me a platform for my activism, right? So what kept me here, and that's a bit of my journey.
Yeah, that's so great to hear. And an impressive journey. And it's so interesting. I've been on the sales side my whole career. So I've never ventured into the agency world or the client world. So I'm always fascinated with people who've kind of had diverse experiences, whether it be marketing or field sales like you did at Lilly, startups versus big kind of multinational corps like a PepsiCo. But I'm curious, getting back to your Lilly experience, being in field sales in particular, and seeing the impact, as you had mentioned, on even the things that, even though you were selling, I'm assuming, to the doctors and the medical kind of field at large, seeing that breakdown in marketing communications, right, as it relates to diverse communities, and especially with the diabetes drug, which disproportionately impacts those communities. I'm curious if that stuck with you through all of these years of, like, I really need to think about, and we're going to get into this in a second because I want to spend some time on authenticity, but I'm curious, even at that early stage, if that kind of, that experience of like, my gosh, there are a lot of people who need these drugs who maybe aren't even aware of them or aren't being communicated to properly as it relates to the messaging. It doesn't speak to them. It's too pharma driven. It's too clinical. It's not human enough. Like, has that stuck with you through the years?
Yeah, and I think you're spot on in that observation, right? A lot of times what would led me to feel like the resources that I had as is were inadequate is that I didn't feel like it really spoke to these communities, right? It didn't really speak to their situation and to their unique needs, right? And so I think when I was a rep, for me, I mean, obviously, I am an underrepresented minority, and part of my own personal experience shapes my thinking about underrepresented communities. But when I was a rep, it deepened even more my empathy and my understanding for communities of color, right, and the challenges that they face. And on top of that, I think what I really saw and what really kind of connects to marketing and what I do now, I just felt like the resources often like it talked at communities of color, right? It was like, oh, okay, we could just translate this to Spanish and that's enough. And it's so much more than that. Like the materials have to be resonant, right? We really have to understand what the challenges are. What are the problems that we're trying to solve? And I think there, are some people that are really passionate about that unlock and who really get the nuances that are so essential to, making sure that you can land the message the right way with communities of color.
Yeah, it's a great point, landing the message. And I think that's a great transition. One of the more interesting byproducts, and I say interesting in quotations because it's not even the most appropriate way to describe it, but one of the more interesting byproducts of the kind of social movements we're living through in Black Lives Matter is the reimagining of authenticity in messaging. Right? Owning the message, being authentic, being purpose driven, all of those things are important. Resonance, another kind of important kind of adjective to use. How do you resonate with the consumer in meaningful, real ways? I'm curious how you speak to authenticity every day at PepsiCo in your mindset and in practice. What are you employing every day? Like, is there a filter that you use as a professional to say, boy, that doesn't feel authentic, or that's not going to resonate in the right way? Let's talk about that for a second.
Let's talk about it. And I'll try hard not to go on and on and on because I really could when it comes to authenticity. I think it's so important, right? It's so important because of today's environment, right? And all the things that are swirling in the external climate. But it's even that much more important when you're talking about communities of color, right? And I think it starts first with really unpacking what does authenticity mean? Like at the root of the word, what are we talking about? And I think authenticity is really rooted in genuineness. And it's also really rooted in realness, right? And kind of as I mentioned before, it's speaking to people, not talking at them. And I think, it really starts with having the right insights and the right strategy. And one of the things that we are, like relentless about diving into as a Hispanic business unit team is the insights, right? So, first thing is let's talk about the Hispanic community in particular, right? No community is a monolith, but I think that, is really, really prevalent when you talk about Hispanics, right? So it's like, do you understand where it comes together? Do you understand where it breaks apart? Right? For the Hispanic community, country of origin is a differentiator. So you look at the West and Central, so states like California and Texas, right, where it's about 80% Mexican American. When you start to talk about the Northeast, New York, or the Southeast, Florida, you do have some Mexican Americans, but you've got other types of Hispanic cohorts that are more dominant, right? Maybe Puerto Ricans or Dominicans here in New York, right? And so, while there are common themes that run across the Hispanic community, like family and tradition and culture, things may break apart when you start to talk about passion points, when you talk about sports. And it's funny, we were actually having this conversation this morning, right? Boxing, is that something that resonates with Puerto Ricans as easily as Mexican American? Maybe, maybe not, right? Or even when you think about holidays. So I've got one program in market with my brand Manzanita Soul, which is an apple soda. We're talking about expanding the brand to other markets like New York and Florida. We've got a Dia de los Muertos program in market in California and Texas. Dia de los Muertos is a very resonant holiday for Mexican Americans. It's a joyous celebration of loved ones that have moved on. When you talk about other Hispanic cohorts, like, does it translate the same way? Do they feel the same way about that holiday? Even though it's gaining popularity, right? And you're seeing it more in mainstream. How do they feel about that? Does that really speak to them? And I think those are the types of questions that you have to ask and ultimately get the answers to. Now, let's talk about the Black community, right? And Black Lives Matter. So, the same principles apply here. The Black community is not a monolith either, right? And, you have to understand what those nuances are and where things also sort of break apart. Of course, there are themes here that also run across the community. I think for Black consumers, it's about humanity. It's about Black excellence, right? Because largely those are the two things that they felt or they feel that, they've been denied, by society. And then you think about the climate and then like how much more those themes are amplified in times like this. So I mentioned earlier that I'm part of the Equality Task Force. And in June, PepsiCo actually announced $430 million in support against the Black equality agenda. And so that means, we've got commitments across three planks: people, business, and community. So on the people front, it's things like representation. It's things like recruiting at HBCUs. When you talk about business, it's, supporting Black-owned businesses. It's amplifying Black voices in marketing. And then from a community standpoint, things like funding for social justice organizations, standing up Black restaurants. We've got a very big food service business. And so while I think that, we've always, as PepsiCo, leaned into Black talent, had programs that were pointed at Black consumers, what this moment has done, right, is frankly given us more of an impetus to create more resonant and authentic work that speaks to where the community is at this moment. And two examples of that: last month, we actually announced that we are the inaugural partner of the Black Effect Podcast Network, which is a partnership between Charlemagne the God and iHeart. But basically what it means is that there are now 18 podcasts solely focused on Black issues, Black talent that are now going to live under this network. So with this deal, iHeart and the Black Effect Network are now going to be the largest publisher of Black podcast talent. So you think about, again, to this point about communities not being a monolith, this is a great platform to, really share a variety of different Black voices. So that's one thing. And then the last thing, and, I promise I won't go on, but I told you I could go on and on about authenticity. Even though I didn't touch this work, right? This was great work done by some of our other marketers, but just this week, Life Water, which is, one of our lifestyle water brands, we announced our Black Art Rising campaign, right? And really what the goal of this campaign is to elevate the voices of Black artists that push for change, right? So this is protest art. We have a digital art gallery that's going to display all of their art. We're going to provide funding, and then there'll be more things down the road. But it's work like this that I think speaks to authenticity. And I'll close on this part by saying this, and this may seem random, but you'll see kind of where I'm going with this. So I was looking at Twitter this morning, and there's a movie coming out on HBO Max called Charm City Kings, right? And it's about, Black dirt bike culture in Baltimore. And they had different critics weighing in, right? It's unapologetic, it's raw. And then there was this one critic that said, it's unabashedly Black. And I thought about that, and I thought about, some of the recent work that has come out of these equality commitments. And I said, man, that really, I think, describes the sentiment of Black consumers right now, right? And this whole conversation around authenticity. They want brands to embrace them being unabashedly Black. And I think when brands do things like that, that's when you see truly authentic work.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's not even something for me to agree on. I don't think I think it's everyone agrees on all of those points. One thing I want to bring up that we didn't use, one of the adjectives we didn't use is the word commitment, right? Or the verb, commitment is so important. And the commitment part to me speaks to resonance, right? You can't be real unless you're putting your mind and your money where it matters. There are a lot of people out there who want to appear to be players and committed, but aren't taking the action necessary. And I think it's impressive the work that PepsiCo is doing. I think personally, the Black Art Rising, and you and I've spoken about this, the Black Art Rising installation, as I would call it, although it's virtual, is beyond impressive and beautiful. And I encourage everybody who's on this kind of virtual chat to go check it out. Yasmin's got it posted. I'll post it on my LinkedIn. It's phenomenal. The artists are incredible. The work they do is incredible. The design could be the best web design I've seen in a long time. It's great to see the promotion of this disparate group of artists doing really amazing work in their community. So kudos to you guys. Let's shift gears. Let's go to the crowd. We've got a few minutes left. There are many questions flowing in, but I want to give you an opportunity to kind of speak to some of these questions. So a couple of them are really interesting. Here's one from the crowd. When you feel like you're repeatedly not being heard by your management because you're one of the few that have the courage to be vocal, what suggestions do you have to help communication among colleagues and management? I love that question. That's a tough one. I'm sorry, I started you off with a tough one.
That is a tough one. I think first, it sort of starts with the insights, right? And the insights can be in, a more traditional sense, right? Like through, some of our vendors or partners, or it can be the pulse of the people, right? And, that's something that we've definitely been very actively engaged in with all of the racial unrest, like checking in with our folks just to see how they're feeling, but then bundling that information and then taking it to our senior leaders and making it real. This is how people are feeling. This is what people want to see in this moment, right? And this is the timeline, frankly, that they have the appetite for change for, right? So I think whenever you can shift the conversation from being more of an I and being more rooted in the insights and speaking to the group at large. And then frankly, also, I'll tell you, one of the things that we did on the Equality Task Force when we were trying to socialize some of the actions we wanted leadership to take, we included quotes from different Black employees about how they were feeling, like how, in some pockets, they felt like there was a lack of opportunity, but that made it real for them. These are real employees. These are real quotes, real statements coming from them. So I think if you can do those things and then also couple it with what's happening externally, right? How other companies are stepping up in this particular moment, or how other companies are being more progressive in that agenda, then you arm leadership with the data points, right? That are harder to refute. so that they feel more compelled to take action?
So yeah, that's. I think that your participation in the PBNA Equality Task Force, Mosaic, I think that a lot of companies aren't built that way yet necessarily, or aren't that progressive necessarily. If your company's not progressive, force them to be more progressive. Start, employee groups, form, it. I hate to say unionize, it's the wrong way to describe it, but there is power in numbers as it relates to
Absolutely.
having a voice. And I think that's what gets management's attention all the time. When a diverse group of employees who are incredible professionals get together on a common theme, your voice tends to be elevated in an organization. Sometimes that's what it takes. Let's move on to another question. I think this is for both of us, actually. It was directed towards me, but I think you would have a great answer here. How should older brands gracefully enter newer technology spaces? For example, TikTok, esports. So you've worked on a lot of great brands at PepsiCo, including the ones you're currently working on. How do you think about the newer platforms as it relates to some of those legacy brands that you might be working on?
And so I'll start, and then again, you probably have some great thoughts on this front as well. I mean, I think as a marketer, you always have to have a pulse on everything, and that includes new technology like, TikTok and, other social platforms that are popping up. And so we are always keeping a pulse of that. I think, one, anecdotally, what are people doing on Twitter and social media? Two, through our agency partners, a lot of times they bring ideas to us. But then I think that's where you have to evaluate it and say, okay, for my brand and for our consumer target, what makes the most sense? Right? Because not every platform and every strategy makes sense. The community may not be there, and I'll give you an example. So, within the Hispanic landscape, we have, very detailed segmentation, right? That ranges from consumers that are more traditional, they rely more on close connections to culture from home. And then we've got folks that are, a bit more dialed into American culture. And then we've got a segment that's somewhere in the middle, right? So for our folks that are, we call them preservers, right? That are more dialed into traditions from home, et cetera. Like for them, TikTok may not be the right platform. That may not be the best way to reach them. It's more radio, more out of home, more traditional media. But for some of our more American embracing progressive consumers, right, that are younger, et cetera, something like TikTok, right, if we want to reach the younger multiculturals, that totally makes sense, right? Because that's what everybody is talking about. So, in short, I would say I think it's definitely knowing what's bubbling, what's surfacing, but it's a bit like innovation, right? Like there are early adopters, there are later adopters. You've got to figure out where your brand and where your consumer target is on that curve, and that will dictate whether or not you should lean in at that moment or another moment.
Yeah, agreed. What I would add, and not to be snarky, is the answer is you have to be really deliberate. You can't go in just hoping to throw things against the wall and hoping it sticks. It gets back to the other topics we talked about, being authentic, right? You can't be somebody you're not. You need to find a way to reposition your brand, all the while holding on to the authenticity of your brand. And as importantly, being authentic to the audience on that platform. Every platform has a different value proposition to that consumer. They're on TikTok for a reason versus Facebook or Instagram or Pinterest. And the value prop to that consumer is very different. And their expectations of you as a brand or a programmer like us is very different. The other thing I would say is, and it's something you mentioned earlier that's so important to all of us, insights. Don't jump onto a platform with any brand until you spend a considerable amount of time digging into the platform-led insights, because a good platform will help lead the way for you. They'll uncover those opportunities of connection for you on the platform. you can't think that you can do it alone. Nobody can do it alone. We can't do it alone as a programmer, and our brand partners can't do it alone either. The platforms have an incredible amount of insight into the consumer behavior, and if they're good, they will lead you down the right path of success. That's all I have to say about that. I think we're wrapping up shortly. I could be wrong. We have time for another question here. Sure. Let's see. So here's another one. What trends in consumer behavior are of particular importance to you and marketers at PepsiCo now? And how is that impacted by consumer, media consumption and those shifts that we all feel are happening in real time in every moment of the day?
That's a good one. So I'll say, I hate to refer to this as a trend, but it's definitely something that is impacting consumers, and that's COVID, right? So obviously COVID has completely reshaped the world as we know it. It's changed, how we engage a bit with brands, how we procure certain products. And when you think about COVID, right, it's had a disproportionate impact on minorities, right? And so if you look at Hispanics, right, it necessitates first understanding how in this moment it is impacting them. How are they feeling, right? And with Hispanics, it's anxiousness, it's a feeling of being overwhelmed, it's a feeling of being confused, but at the same time, right, there's a bit of optimism that's coming through there. And then you look at, the impact on the Hispanic community with job losses, right? And so at one point for Hispanics, it peaked at about 19%, whereas it was around 14% for whites. And so then you have to kind of process those things and then say, okay, so what is that necessitating in terms of changes in consumer behavior? And what we've seen is, one, it means they're spending a lot more time at home, more time in that multi-generational household, which is a hallmark of, Hispanic households. On top of that, they're taking up more home projects. We've also seen that they're actually leaning in online, right? And so they're buying more products online since the pandemic has started versus before. And so then as a marketer, you're saying, okay, so what does that mean that I need to do different, right? And I think the do different is, one, okay, well, if they're leaning in online, we need to be more present online. We need to make sure we have the right assortment online. We need to make sure we're showing up for them in a way that is culturally resonant online. And when it comes to the marketing programs, right? So all of the programs that my team is running next year and, that our Pepsi arm is running next year, we've dialed up the focus on value, right? Because this community has been deeply impacted by COVID, right? So I think again, I hate to call COVID a trend, but if you look at, phenomenons or things that are impacting consumers, it's looking at it from all of those different aspects in terms of, how is it making them feel? How is that changing their behavior? And then as brands and as marketers, like, what do we need to do different?
Great. Thank you for that.
Well, huge thank you to Yasmin and Jeff. Thank you for closing out our State of the Industry Week with a day on diversity, inclusion, and multicultural marketing. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, everyone.
A special thank you to all of our speakers and moderators for such engaging and insightful conversations today. I personally took so much from each of these sessions. We hope you will all join Brand Innovators next week, Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern, for a packed day on C-suite and marketing leadership. Tuesday actually marks Brand Innovators' 100th virtual live cast, so especially excited for next week. We'll be joined by C-suite marketing executives from PepsiCo, Kimberly-Clark, Popeyes, Fiverr, and more. Thank you so much for joining, everyone, and we hope to see you again.